He walked into the base cafeteria with a uniform faded from time, not regulation. Wrong shoes, collar a little too wide. Some recruits laughed, whispered, "Where'd he dig that thing up? Halloween." One of them called out, "Hey old timer, lose your platoon?" He didn't answer, just carried his tray, sat alone. They didn't know who he was. Didn't know that 30 years ago, this man taught more soldiers how to survive than half their manuals. And when he finally looked up, he didn't get mad. He just said, "Tell your CO Sergeant Wallace I said hello. I trained him." And the room fell silent. If you believe respect isn't earned in what you wear, but in what you've given, then share this story. Subscribe to Endless Stories, where forgotten voices echo louder than applause. He arrived 10 minutes before lunch rotation, not early by accident, but by habit. The kind of habit you never shake even when the orders stop coming. He parked a 2002 Chevy pickup that wheezed more than it roared. License plate dull with age. Bumper faded with a peeling Marine Corps decal barely visible under dust and sun. He stepped out slow, not weak, measured. Like every joint had done more than it was designed for, and every step was permission, not assumption. His uniform was regulation at some point, but not anymore. The stitching was original. The collar was slightly uneven. His boots weren't shined but weren't careless. The name patch read Hollis, barely clinging to the thread. He had no rank on his sleeve, no ID badge clipped to his chest. But somehow he looked like he still outranked the room. He walked into the Fort Jasper mess hall without hesitation, holding a plastic tray like he'd been issued one 1,000 times before. The room was buzzing. New recruits mid-joke, mid-brag, loud like youth always is when it forgets where it stands. Some looked up, some didn't, but one table noticed immediately. For soldiers, maybe 20, maybe less. Fresh cuts, jokes rehearsed. One nudged the other. "Check out Captain History." The next one laughed. "That uniform's older than my mom." The third smirked. He probably showed up for chow in 91 and just forgot to leave. The fourth leaned back and called out, "Sir, do you need directions to the retirement center?" The old man, Hollis, didn't flinch, didn't scowl, just stood in line like any other body in uniform. Eyes ahead, tray steady, posture perfect. That's what threw them off most. Not the wrinkles, not the limp, not the faded metals barely visible on his chest. It was the stillness, like he was in a room full of children playing army and didn't want to interrupt. Behind the counter, the mess sergeant frowned. Not out of suspicion, out of recognition. The face was vaguely familiar, not recent, but enough to make him check the nameplate. And when he saw Hollis, something in his hand froze. A serving spoon paused mid-scoop, but he said nothing, just handed over the mashed potatoes with both hands, like he was delivering something sacred. Hollis made it to the end of the line, found a seat by the far window, same one he always took when he used to eat here, back when his name carried weight, not dust. He sat. No one joined him, but more started noticing. Something didn't feel right. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. Why would a man that age be here? In that uniform? Alone? The sergeant from earlier, the one with the loud mouth, stood, approached. Not out of courage. Out of the kind of pride that wants to win a room. "Hey, old-timer," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "You lose a time machine or just miss the glory days?" A few laughs followed. The old man didn't even blink. Just cut a piece of his overcooked chicken like it mattered more. Another soldier leaned in. "You sure this isn't stolen valor? Or is this just cosplay?" Hollis looked up now, slowly, calm, like a man who'd stared down worse and never needed to prove it. He didn't speak, not yet, but the way he looked through the sergeant, not at him, was enough to chill the laughter mid-breath. That's when a corporal 2 tables over, mid-30s, tight cut, scars on both hands, started watching harder. His tray was untouched now. He leaned in to a friend. "That's not just some vet," he muttered. "I swear I've seen his name before. In the manuals. In the training modules." "Yeah?" his friend asked. The corporal nodded slowly. "I think he trained half the instructors at Pendleton." The sergeant was still talking. Look, if you're lost, we can call someone. Might even get you a ride to the museum. Maybe dust you off a bench. The old man sipped his water, unmoved. Then, finally, with perfect calm, he looked up, locked eyes with the room, and said the first words all morning. Tell your CO, Sergeant Wallace, that Hollis says hi. The room shifted. The corporal stood. Wait, Hollis? As in Master Gunnery Sergeant Hollis. Someone dropped a fork. Because everyone at Fort Jasper knew Sergeant Wallace. Strict, unbreakable, respected. And if this was the man who trained him, then every single one of them had just mocked the hands that shaped the one they feared most. The silence after his sentence wasn't total, not at first. It wavered, like a ripple waiting to decide if it was worth becoming a wave. But then the corporal, still standing, repeated it louder, this time not as a question. Master Gunnery Sergeant Hollis. That's him. And that was when the air changed. Not the way a door slams shut, but the way oxygen seems to thin when someone mentions a name you've only ever seen written on doctrine. Never expected to see walk through a door holding a plastic tray. The loud sergeant's smirk wavered. Wait, he muttered. You're serious? The corporal nodded once, eyes still fixed on the old man like someone who just realized they'd been mouthing off in front of a ghost. They made us study him in advanced tactics. He wrote half the live fire safety manuals. That ambush training scenario in Phase 3, that was his unit. He led it. He turned back toward Hollis, slower now. You trained my CO? Hollis didn't nod, didn't grin. He just took another bite of food. Before Wallace was a commander, he said calmly. He was a grunt with a temper and a limp trigger finger. We fixed both. Nobody laughed. The loud sergeant stepped back. He wasn't apologizing, not yet. But the way his body shifted said enough. His hands moved to his hips. Not confrontational, defensive, like his uniform had suddenly gotten tighter. I didn't know, he said quieter. The old man looked at him for the first time, really looked. His eyes were the kind that didn't blink unless they meant to. That's the thing about respect, Hollis said. You shouldn't need a resume to earn it. Just a uniform worn right, and a life carried with some weight. The corporal sat back down without touching his food. Someone behind him mumbled, "Damn," just loud enough for it to land like a confession. Even the mess sergeant behind the counter, who had stopped pretending to stir the chili tray, stepped forward now. "Sir," he said carefully, "you want a hot plate? Something fresh." Hollis waved him off with a flick of 2 fingers. "I didn't come to be noticed. Just wanted to see how the place turned out." And now the recruits who had laughed had gone completely still. One of them stared at his own boots like they weren't worthy of the floor they touched. Another reached for his hat, holding it tight in his lap. The sergeant who'd started it all finally exhaled. "I'm sorry, Master Guns," he said. "Not dramatic, just honest. Didn't mean to." But Hollis cut him off gently. "You did mean to. That's the problem. You just didn't think it would matter." Then he sipped his water and added, "That's how respect dies. One joke at a time." And with that, no more was said, because nothing else needed to be. The loudest noise in the mess hall was now a fork scraping the edge of a tray. And that's when people started noticing something else. He didn't just wear the uniform longer. He wore it better, because he never had to prove it. It was subtle at first. The kind of shift you don't notice unless you're used to reading rooms the way old soldiers read terrain. But those who were watching, really watching, felt it in their spine. The corporal who had spoken first now sat straighter than before. Not from fear, from respect, from something closer to reverence, maybe. He reached for his cap and placed it carefully on the tray in front of him. Not the way a recruit does to follow orders, but the way someone does when he knows he's in the presence of a name he was told to memorize but never thought he'd see walk, breathe, sit, eat like the rest of them. Across the room, a woman, Captain, Signal Corps, probably mid-30s, who'd been quietly reviewing paperwork during lunch now closed her binder. She didn't speak, just turned her chair slightly so she could face him. Her eyes scanned him head to toe, but not critically, thoughtfully. like someone searching a memory for verification. Then her gaze softened, because she remembered it. A field manual with the name Hollis, M.Gysgt read. In the footnotes, listed not as author, but as reference contributor, classified exercises. She didn't interrupt, just nodded once as if saying, "I see you now." The private who had laughed hardest was now stirring the mashed potatoes on his tray without eating. He looked up once, caught Hollis's eye, and quickly looked away. The others at his table had gone quiet. One picked up a napkin and started folding it. Another tapped the edge of his boot nervously. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but it was the beginning of shame. And shame, when it lands right, doesn't make you cry. It makes you listen. By the drink station, a warrant officer with more salt than pepper in his hair leaned over to the mess sergeant. "You didn't tell me Hollis was still breathing." The mess sergeant shook his head. "I didn't know. Thought he moved out west. Heard he went off-grid years ago." The warrant officer narrowed his eyes. "He trained my dad. My dad doesn't shut up about him. Told me once. Hollis could train a boot to lead without ever raising his voice. Said he ran drills so real. Guys came home already changed. And now, they were watching him eat. Not out of spectacle, but because he wasn't eating like a man proving a point. He was just finishing a meal he'd earned 100 times over." A civilian contractor, ex-Air Force, now logistics, walked slowly past his table, stopped short, and without asking, placed a can of root beer next to his tray. Hollis looked up. The man simply nodded. "Always saw you drink that at Pendleton," he said quietly, then walked away. No thanks needed. It was enough that he remembered. Then the door opened. A new set of soldiers entered, joking, loud. One of them said, "What? Did someone die in here?" Before realizing the entire hall had gone still. They paused, unsure why the air felt thicker than usual. Then they saw him, saw the way others were sitting, saw the corporal with his cap off, the captain with her binder closed, the tray with the untouched root beer. They didn't know who he was, but they knew enough not to say anything. And that's how it spreads. Not through orders, not through consequences, but through presence. Through the way people begin to carry themselves different, straighter, when someone who once trained their entire chain of command is quietly finishing a plate of eggs. Across the room, the one who moved first was a chaplain. Not in robes, just fatigues. Simple black cross stitched above the left pocket. Sleeves rolled, tray still full, untouched. He was sitting near the window, watching the entire thing unfold with the kind of stillness only men who've seen too many regrets in hospital beds can hold. He didn't say a word at first, just stood, carefully wiped his hands with a napkin, and approached Hollis's table like a man entering sacred ground. Not slow, deliberate. A silence fell again, heavier this time. The scrape of his boots across tile echoed like it belonged in a chapel. He stopped beside Hollis, not across, not looming, just beside, and said quietly, "Sir, I served with Lieutenant Colonel Wallace back in Mosul. He used to say your name the way some people say, church." He paused, eyes low. "I'd like to thank you, not for what you did for him, for what you did for us, all of us, because the man he became shaped the men we now follow." Hollis looked up, didn't smile, but something behind the eyes softened. Not pride, but recognition. The quiet kind. The chaplain reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, faded pocket-sized field guide. Combat Stress Protocol, updated by Training Command, 2004. On the inside cover, scribbled in handwriting worn from sweat and dirt, Lesson 6. Control is the calmest man in the room. M.Gysgt Hollis. He set it down beside the tray, then straightened up, turned toward the room and said without raising his voice, "That man over there taught us how to survive before we even knew we'd need to." He turned back, gave a nod like a bow, and walked away, leaving the book behind. After that, it wasn't a moment anymore. It became a ripple. The mess sergeant, who'd watched it all from behind the line, came out from the back, apron still on, gloves half removed, and wordlessly brought a clean set of utensils. Not because Hollis needed them, but because it was the only thing he could do that felt like enough. He placed them gently on the table, then stepped back, hands behind his back, posture locked like he was back on day one of boot. "I remember your voice," he said softly. "You yelled at me in '02 at Pendleton. You made me run the hill twice for calling someone bro information." Hollis didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The man laughed, just once. Not mockery, nostalgia. "I thought I hated you, but turns out you're the reason I didn't break the day after my first casualty." A junior officer, second lieutenant, probably no more than 24, crossed the room now. Young face, but something hardened in his eyes. He approached slowly, removed his cap before speaking. "Sir, I was raised by a gunny. Vietnam. He taught me how to salute before I could tie my boots. Said if I ever met a real warrior, I'd know without needing a ribbon chart." He looked down. "I think I just did." One by one, they stepped forward. Some spoke, some didn't. A private left a packet of peanut butter, his favorite, untouched, next to Hollis's plate like an offering. Another scribbled something on a napkin and laid it down, but didn't stay long enough for anyone to read it. A female sergeant with a prosthetic left her name tag beside the water cup and walked out in silence. No tears, no ceremony, just the quiet weight of knowing. He's the reason I'm still standing. And through it all, Hollis didn't posture, didn't absorb. He just sat, same as before, like none of it surprised him, because he hadn't come for recognition. But the recognition came anyway, and this time, the room was finally ready to carry it. It was the corporal, the one who recognized him first, who finally stood up again. He walked to the side of Hollis's table, not hesitantly, but carefully, as if he was approaching something fragile, something historical. He held something in his hand, a printout folded twice, corner dog-eared. "Sir," he said quietly, "may I show them?" Hollis glanced up, gave a barely there nod. The corporal turned to the room, held the paper chest high. "For those of you who don't know who this man is, let me help you." He unfolded the sheet slowly. It was an article, a photocopy from a decades-old training publication. Title: Shaping Men Before Battle, The Quiet Doctrine of Master Gunnery Sergeant Hollis. Underneath it, a grainy black and white photo of a younger Hollis, same eyes, same jawline, but with sharper lines and rows of ribbons across his chest. The byline dated back to 1996. The caption: "The man behind the first psychological endurance simulations at Pendleton." A few soldiers gasped. One muttered, "No way." The corporal kept reading. "This is the guy who designed Phase 4 of the Joint Readiness Trials, the protocols that prepped Marine teams before Fallujah. The guy who built the resilience modules we now call Standard Issue. My squad leader still teaches his exact breathing drills for field panic control." He looked around. "You've all heard his methods. You just didn't know the name behind them." The lieutenant from earlier stepped forward now. He'd found something too, pulled from his rucksack. A laminated card, one passed out during NCO school. On it, printed in small block text, a code of conduct for decision-making under fire. At the bottom, adapted from principles of M.GYSGT. Hollis, USMC. He held it up wordlessly, then placed it on the table next to Hollis's plate, hands slightly shaking, not from nerves but awe. And then the captain, the woman with the closed binder, stood and added, almost as if confessing to a group, "I've quoted him in briefings, cited him in command evaluations. I've trained men on principles he wrote, never once knowing he was still alive, let alone sitting in my mess hall." The chaplain, still standing nearby, added quietly, "He taught more leaders than most academies ever could, not because he wanted credit, but because he understood what comes after the medals fade." No one sat down. Not yet. And then Hollis finally spoke again. His voice was calm, still gravelly, like stone rolled across steel. But this time, something inside it loosened. "I didn't write for recognition," he said. "I wrote because too many of us came back broken. I wanted the next ones to come back whole. Or at least, better than we did." He picked up the laminated card, looked at it, then handed it back. Never thought I'd see that again, let alone from the hands of someone who actually lived it. A young private near the corner asked the question no one had dared speak. "Sir, why didn't you ever come back? Why disappear?" Hollis looked down at his tray, then out the window, the afternoon sun hitting his face just right to show the years etched into the lines near his eyes. Because sometimes, the hardest thing for a teacher is watching what happens when the classroom turns into a battlefield. No one asked more after that, because that answer said enough. And for the first time, they didn't just know who he was. They knew what he'd carried, while everyone else was still learning how to walk. No order was given. No one barked a command. And yet, one by one, soldiers across the mess hall began adjusting their posture. The corporal who had read from the article stood with his hands behind his back, heels together, like he wasn't in a cafeteria anymore, but in front of a formation he didn't dare slouch in. The lieutenant picked up the laminated card from Hollis's table, smoothed its edges carefully, and slipped it back into his chest pocket. Not casually, but like someone holstering a weapon he now understood had always meant more than he realized. A young private, probably the youngest in the room, took off his cover and set it gently on his tray, turned toward Hollis, and with a voice too soft for someone in uniform said, "I've been in for 6 months. First time I thought about quitting was last week." He hesitated. "Now I think I'll stay." Hollis didn't answer, but he didn't need to, because the kid's eyes weren't looking for praise, only permission. And in Hollis's stillness, he found it. The mess sergeant returned, this time without gloves or apron, holding something wrapped in cloth. A challenge coin, one of the older brasscore ones, the kind you don't buy, only get handed. He laid it on the table. "I got this the day we pulled 7 men from a burning Humvee," he said. "I thought I'd earned it." He looked at Hollis. "Now I know who trained the man that trained me." He left it there, didn't wait for a reply, just walked back like something had finally settled in his chest that had been loose for years. Near the entrance, a row of boots had begun to form, not left behind but polished. 5, then 6, then a dozen. Lined up along the base of the wall, toes perfectly squared, laces tucked. No explanation, just a quiet act from those who once mocked, now honoring the feet that walked before theirs. Someone had started it. No one said who. And in the far corner, where a wall-mounted TV usually ran sports recaps or cable news, someone had muted the screen and changed the channel. Now looping a slideshow of historical marine photos, black and white training fields, young men covered in dirt, fatigue, and willpower. In one of the shots, grainy and sun-drenched, was a figure standing arms crossed, boots dug in, jaw like stone. No caption, but anyone in the room could see. It was him. The chaplain returned, this time not alone. He walked beside the base's civilian historian, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a notebook full of half-finished interviews. She didn't interrupt, just stepped up, leaned slightly forward and said, "We've been trying to track you for years. I've documented 148 instructors. None have your reach. Your name's on declassified records, buried in doctrine, footnotes in at least 12 manuals. But no photos, no interview." She paused. "Would you let me record your voice?" Hollis shook his head. "No," he said, not unkindly. "I didn't show up to be remembered. Just hungry. That was the end of that. But not the end of what changed. Because from that day forward, that table, that exact seat, never stayed empty again. Not because he always returned, but because someone always sat there better than they did the day before. Not louder, not tougher, just straighter, more aware. And the wall beside it? Someone taped a handwritten sign. No title, no rank, no quote, just 5 words. Speak less, stand straighter, remember him. And nobody ever tore it down. By the end of the week, his name had already spread. Not through press releases, not through base announcements, but through whispers. The kind that carry faster than orders, because they're repeated with respect, not obligation. "Did you hear? Hollis." "Yeah, that Hollis. He came through the mess on Tuesday." "No, not a rumor. I was there. He sat right across from me. Didn't say much, but when he did, and just like that, the man who had sat quietly at a table with cold food was now etched into every hallway conversation like a living ghost. Not haunting anyone, just reminding them they're still being watched. The ripple reached the training units first. Instructors paused mid-sentence to tell the story, not to inspire but to check their own tone. "We teach tactics based on a man who walked among you last week," one sergeant told his fire team. "And none of you noticed. What does that say about your eyes?" Then the bulletin board in the main barracks changed. Not officially, just overnight. Taped between the duty roster and the fire drill map was a printed quote. "Control is the calmest man in the room. M.GYSGT. Hollis." No one signed it, but no one touched it either. 2 days later, the CO of the base, the same Wallace Hollis had mentioned, addressed his officers in a closed-door debrief. He didn't speak of operations. Not at first. He opened with a pause. Then, "I heard we had a visitor last week. Someone who didn't ask to be seen, but deserved more than we gave." Then he said something no one forgot. "If a man like that walks through our halls and the first thing we give him is a joke, we don't need new doctrine. We need to start over." That quote made it to the whiteboard of every squad bay by Friday. A week after that, the base newspaper, usually filled with softball scores and promotion lists, quietly published an op-ed. No author listed, just a title. "The Day the Room Sat Straighter." In it, a first-person account of the moment the joke stopped. The root beer, the line, "Tell Wallace I said hi." It ended with, "He taught us without speaking, corrected us without punishing, and left without asking for a thing." And then, something happened no one predicted. The mess hall updated its seating chart. Not officially, no announcement, but every staff member, from dish crew to senior mess chief, knew not to assign that corner seat again. The one by the window, where Hollis had sat. They didn't mark it. They didn't rope it off. They just left it untouched. The coffee machine was moved slightly so the sunlight didn't glare across the tray. A small wooden box appeared under the table, holding laminated copies of his training codes. No one admitted who put them there, but everyone knew what they were. Even visiting units started hearing it. Reservists from out of state, recruits in from boot. They'd glance at the empty seat and ask, "Is this taken?" And someone would say quietly, "Only by the man who made half of us better soldiers." From then on, when someone got too loud in the mess, too proud, too casual, all it took was a glance at that seat. And suddenly their voice dropped, their back straightened, their laugh faded. He wasn't there, but he never really left. It wasn't just soldiers who changed. It was the barista at the base coffee shop who, after reading the op-ed, stopped rolling her eyes when retirees fumbled their change. It was the teen cashier at the gas station who started greeting older men in faded camo with a full sentence instead of a nod. It was the middle school history teacher who rewrote a quiz question from Name 3 U.S. generals to describe what makes a quiet leader. People didn't talk about him constantly, but the way they acted made it clear they hadn't stopped thinking about him either. At Mason's diner off Highway 12, a waitress named Shelley put up a sign above her tip jar. "For the ones who trained your commander, coffee's on us." And every few mornings, a table of quiet older men, all ball caps and creaky knees, would come in, nod once, and sit without asking. The staff never asked for names, just brought coffee, black, 2 sugars. One of them once left a patch behind, not from his own unit, but from Hollis's, pinned to the seat cushion with a safety pin. At the barber on Main Street, a customer in his 20s had made fun of a vet's thick hearing aids. The room went silent. Then the owner, a man who hadn't raised his voice in 20 years, said calmly, "Man walked in here once, didn't say a word, but every haircut since has felt like it should matter more." The customer paid and left without a word. He came back the next week, didn't say anything about it, but this time he held the door open for 2 old Marines. At the town library, the local historian had printed out the article from the base newsletter and slipped it into the local veterans file. But she didn't stop there. She added a handwritten note on the folder. "Legacy. The kind you feel in your posture." And across town, without any coordination, things began appearing. A wooden bench in the park, suddenly sanded and polished, with a small carved inscription. For the ones who taught before they spoke. No one signed it, but someone cleaned it every Friday. Then came the high school assembly. A junior ROTC instructor stood on stage, looking at the rows of restless teenagers, and said, "Last month, a man walked through our military base and changed the way they sit, speak, and think. Not because he gave a speech, but because they realized too late. They were in the presence of someone who never needed to demand respect. He just never lost it." And then he pulled out a laminated card, the same one from NCO training. Read the quote out loud. "Control is the calmest man in the room." Then added, "If you only remember one thing this year, let it be that." They didn't all understand it that day, but some did. One of them, a boy who never raised his hand in class, went home and wrote a letter to his grandfather, a vet he'd barely spoken to. Gave it to him on Sunday. His grandfather cried in the car, because some echoes don't come from music. They come from men who didn't speak often. But when they did, the room sat straighter. He didn't return to the mess hall. Not that week. Not the next. No one made an announcement. No memorial was planned. But somewhere between the unopened packet of peanut butter still sitting on his old table and the untouched cup of black coffee placed there each morning, people began to understand. Hollis wasn't coming back. He hadn't made a scene, hadn't said goodbye, but something about his absence spoke louder than any salute. It didn't feel like abandonment, felt like passing a torch. And suddenly, everyone realized they weren't holding it with two hands. The sergeant who mocked him first was the first to break. He didn't file a report. He just walked into the base chapel, waited until it was empty, and placed something small on the altar. A folded slip of paper with 5 words. "I didn't earn that moment." He never signed it. He didn't need to. Everyone knew it was him, and no one shamed him for it. The corporal who'd recognized Hollis returned to the table one evening when the mess was nearly empty. He sat across from the empty chair, placed the laminated article copy back where it had first been unfolded, and whispered, "I think we all thought you'd live forever, because you acted like someone who already had." He left the article there. The wind from the open door flipped it once. No one touched it again. Then came the photo. Someone, no one admitted who, taped an old black and white photograph to the mess hall wall above Hollis's table. No frame, just yellowed tape. It was him, younger, sharper, flanked by 2 recruits in a dusty training yard. All 3 were laughing. The caption underneath was handwritten. "We didn't understand him then. We do now." A week later, a new laminated sign appeared beside it. Not official, just clear. "This seat is not empty. It's held." No one sat there again, and no one dared remove the sign. Outside the base gates, the ripple reached farther. An old Marine widow in town, who had never met Hollis, brought a tray of sandwiches to the recruiting office and said, "Just in case one of you trains someone who trains someone like him." A pastor rewrote his Sunday homily around the phrase, "earned silence." A mechanic paid for a young soldier's oil change without a word, left a note on the seat. For M.A. Ash. Back on base, the CO, Wallace, who had once been just another grunt in Hollis's fire team, walked into the mess before sunrise, stood in front of that table for a full minute, and placed one single item beside the coffee, his own challenge coin. Not because he was giving it away, but because he knew whose coin truly carried more weight. Then he stepped back and saluted, not to the picture, to the chair, and to the man who'd never once asked to be remembered, but would never be forgotten, because he taught them all what memory should feel like. They never found out where he went. Some said Arizona. Others whispered Montana. A few believed he passed away quietly somewhere near the base, alone and exactly how he wanted. But no obituary was ever printed. No folded flag ever handed to a next of kin. Just a seat, a photo, and the memory of a moment that made 100 soldiers realize they were still students, and that their teacher had already left the room. But the seat stayed. Every morning, the coffee still came, black, 2 sugars. Every Sunday, Someone different brought a fresh peanut butter packet. Every now and then, a recruit would glance at the chair, pause, and correct the way he stood. Not because anyone was watching, but because he was. The legend didn't fade. Settled, like dust on boots after a long march. Not heavy, just always there. During training sessions, instructors would pause mid-drill and say, "You remember what Hollis taught us?" Even if none of the trainees had ever met him, the phrase didn't need context anymore. It just meant, you know better, act like it. The ROTC class at the local high school renamed a quiet corner of their classroom the Hollis Wall. It held no medals, no photos, just empty frames and a mirror. One student asked why the mirror. The instructor replied, "Because we don't honor what he looked like. We honor what he saw in us." At the mess hall, someone finally laminated the napkin with the handwritten quote, "Control is the calmest man in the room." It was nailed to the wall beside the photo, beside the folded card, beside the coffee cup. It never tilted. It never faded. No one let it. And every so often, a visitor, civilian or soldier, doesn't matter, would sit down at the table next to his. Not in his seat, just near it. And they'd eat in silence. No phone, no conversation, just stillness. And when they left, they often stood and turned to the chair before walking out. Not to say goodbye, but as if to say, "I heard you. I'll carry it now." Because the truth was, he never wanted a monument. He didn't want his name on plaques or flags or banners. He just wanted the next man to do it better. And somehow, without ever asking, he made sure they did. If this story made you sit a little straighter, if it reminded you of someone who never raised their voice, but changed your life, then don't let it end here. Share the story. Honor the quiet ones. Subscribe to Endless Stories, where legends whisper and silence commands respect.